His sluggish mind grappled with his hopes and fears for a long moment before concluding that the only option available was to proceed with caution. In this weather, he doubted that there would be anyone willing to brave these harsh conditions, but it was also doubtful that Mailer would be left intact after such a violent gale. It was likely the village would be alive with those roused by the storm's fury. Perhaps there would even be a few poor saps struggling to secure their shabby sanctuaries. Shifting his tattered mantle about him, Rise made sure the blade was secure before he continued. Concealing himself as best he could, the young thief shrunk into the murkiest shadow, clinging to the darkest pockets of the path as he journeyed up the passage to Mailer. In spite of his best efforts, Rise trudged noisily through the snow, with each step sinking deeper and deeper into the icy bog. In the darkness of winter's first morn, Rise's heart began to race as he focused with apprehensive anticipation on what lay before him. His eyes strained against the darkness, but he could perceive nothing. The world bore an eerie silence that foretold a nameless peril as the young thief crept toward Mailer. Still the snow level rose, and the boy quickly found himself wading through the icy slog. His breath grew ragged, and his eyes cast frantic glances about him as he approached the outer rim of Mailer. Yet he could find no trace of the stone hovels that had dotted the outskirts of the enclave. Only fresh-laden snow for as far as the eye could see. Stumbling and nearly falling headlong onto the ground, Rise caught himself with outstretched hands. However, it was not stone or snow that greeted his grasp, but brittle thatch. Looking over the placid heaps of plain snow, the boy could just make out dark masses against the white banks. Then, as the moon broke free of the shackles of winter's gloom, his blood froze in his veins, and he found his breath robbed from his lungs. With the moonlight unveiled, Rise surveyed the carnage before him, uncertain of what to make of the sight. The ruin of Mailer was absolute, a hideous spectacle more ghastly than any act of barbarism he had witnessed while within Hydria lay sprawled before him. Among the snow, patches of thatch were haphazardly tossed, disregarded. Protruding from the snow's icy depths, a few splintered timbers jutted like skeleton fingers, clawing at the silver light streaming through the chink in the armor of twilight. Beyond these few markers of civilization, there was nothing. It was as if the vermin of Mailer had been swallowed whole by the mountain ridge. Under the remorseful light of the moon, Rise walked through the scattered ruins as though in a dream. Dazed by the many blows the mountain had inflicted upon his mind, body, and soul, the boy slowly plodded down the very same path that had taken him and his uncle to the town square, now completely concealed by an impenetrable hedge of snow and ice. Occasionally passing by the odd trinket, telling of people who had once made this place their home, Rise drifted through the bandit village like a specter, yet to be free from this world. Eventually the boy's wanderings brought him to the area where he knew Helena's house had rested. Under the avalanche of snow, there was no trace of the quaint hovel where he had spent his last happy moments. Staring at the snow-coated mountain, the boy released a deep sigh that had been building since he entered the clearance. How far had he come, only to be greeted by oblivion? So many times Rise had nearly met his end. So many times that it seemed as if the abyss would swallow him whole and he would be lost forever. Yet here he stood, with the heavens open to him and the heartlands before him. This seemed like some perverse mockery, some foul jest at his expense. Why hadn't he died in that accursed pit and been spared this vain labor? Looking to the wind-swept sky as the moon veiled her face once more, the young thief allowed his bitterness to engulf him. He had lost everything. Kaysen, his life back in Hydria, Ashe and Helena, even a few pals he had made here in Mailer. The boy, Drake of Hydria, was truly dead, and it seemed Siam and Rise would likely join him soon. It would be so easy to succumb to the knight's gentle embrace, and let his worries slip away as he drifted into an endless slumber. However, deep within his heart a fire was kindled. The fact remained, he had survived that blasted pit, the chasm, the accursed creature, the world's edge, and so far, even the bloody mountain with all the fury of winter to aid in its wicked schemes. The night was far from over, but he would see the dawn. Fanning the waning embers of his strength, Rise knew that he would have his work cut out for him if he was to survive this night. But first he must tend to the dead. He did not have much strength left, and certainly not enough to free the maidens from their icy tombs, nor possessed a trinket that he could part with to speed them on their journey. But perhaps he could spare a few parting words. His mind recalled a faded memory of his mother, reciting a prayer that he poorly understood, but the tenderness she had conveyed then felt more appropriate now than Kaysen's rabble-rousing speeches in honor of a fellow scallywag. Slowly he began to murmur it as best as he could. The words were choked and raspy, barely audible over the whispering winds. Hear my words, take comfort in them. I was a stranger, but in the warmth of your smile, I found a place of comfort. Wherever you may go, no matter how far, know that in my heart, there that warmth will always be waiting for you. His voice trailing off as he finished his mother's verse, Rise bowed his head for a time. The wind's whispering ceased altogether, and the memorial passed in perfect stillness. It was in that moment that Rise's ears were pricked by a sweet disturbance. The all too familiar sound of a lute plucked by a skillful hand reverberated in his mind. He could just barely catch a few melodic notes before the wind rose and the tranquil strumming was lost on the gales. Rise swallowed dryly. Either the mountain sought to drive him to madness, or there was at least one survivor in Mailer. He dared not hope that Helena or Ashe were among their ranks, but his heart pleaded within him for it to be so. With no small amount of apprehension, Rise started to stalk in the direction he took the music to have come from. Climbing up the snowbound incline, near the center of the expanse, the boy found the sound once more. Slowly, cautiously, the young thief followed the sound of the music. Trekking further up the snowy slope, nearing the southern walls of the mountain, Rise half expected he was going to meet a specter. However, these fears were quelled upon the sight of an orange light springing to life from inside a splintered building. Immediately he recognized it as the second level of Neville Abio's house, crushed against the southern face of the enclave, half buried in snow. Untying the makeshift scabbard, Rice drew the callus and discarded the tangled vines before quietly proceeding toward the shattered manor. Approaching what was left of the dilapidated building, on his hands and knees the young thief peered in through one of the numerous gaping cracks in the fractured wall. Slumped with his back to Rise, a pale Neville Abio lazily strummed his lute, surrounded by all manner of treasure strewn about his room. Rise could hear his labored breathing over the music, but it was his right hand, stained crimson, that caught the boy's eye. Whatever fate had befallen Mailer, Neville had not escaped unscathed. Turning his eyes from the captive Mailer, Rise marveled at the state of Neville's manor. The impetuous thief's greedy eyes surveyed the luxuries violently flung and scattered about the room in full display. Gold and silver, jewels and ornaments, from travelers far beyond the domain of Arden, littered its floor. However, what truly caught the boy's eye were the stockpiles of dainties. The feast had been grand indeed, but the scoundrel had kept the best for himself. Barrels of mead, some burst but others intact, lay about in plenty. The fire itself was built within such a barrel, and was most likely fueled by the remains of others. Simply being near the flame reminded Rise just how cold he truly was. It was in that moment that the boy figured it was about time he got out of the cold. There was no small amount of risk in confronting Neville Abio, but he had to know what fate had befallen Mailer, and if any had managed to flee before it was too late. From his vantage, he could see a number of entry points available, but he decided to choose the one furthest from the bandit captain. Slinging to the far side of the hovel, Rise considered his course of action. The bandit may seem injured, but he was still far bigger and stronger than Rise. If he could get on top of the boy, then the fight would be over quickly. He would be no match for the expert raider under advantageous circumstances, but Rise was too injured and exhausted. A prolonged fight would not be good for either of them, but Rise believed that in an extended quarrel, his inexperience would show. His one advantage was the callus. Its exhibition against Ningal Suin assured him that even in his current state, a solid blow would end any altercation. He just had to be steady and wait for an opportune moment. Once Neville had answered his questions, Rise halted at the entrance, his eyes locked on the face of Neville Abio. He knew that no matter what, he would be forced to take that man's life. He supposed that he had already claimed the life of another, but that had been different. He hadn't been face to face. He hadn't meant to. He would have to mean to this time. His mind told him to question whether he had the fortitude to kill, but in his heart, Rise already knew. Without another moment of hesitation, Siamon Rise burst from the gash in the wall opposite the bandit captain, brandishing the callus firmly with 2 hands. Neville ceased his melody, but did not set his lute aside as his eyes dully examined the boy's lithe frame. The bandit captain looked in worse shape than Rise had guessed from the outside, but the boy maintained his defensive posture. Neville remained unmoved by the boy's presence as his eyes finally met the boy's. Rise searched the man's face for any sign of emotion or move to strike, but he remained perfectly still, save for his ragged breathing. After a long moment of sizing each other up, Rise spoke. "What happened here?" Rise muttered, his fatigue painfully obvious as it crept into his words and form. Neville remained silent for a long moment before rousing himself from his stupor. "I'm sorry," the bandit muttered. "I suppose that means I'm not dead yet," the gentleman continued. He set aside his instrument, revealing a slight glimpse of a deep crimson stain against his white tunic, before concealing it with a thick blanket about him. "When I saw you here, I was quite certain I had passed on. I suppose that means Kaysen is with you?" Lucky sod. Rise's throat tightened as a flame flickered behind his steel blue eyes. "Ah," Neville murmured, the faintest of smiles touching his lips. Rise adjusted his grip on the callus, the blade shimmering brilliantly in the firelight. "I need to know what happened here," the boys growled. "Are there any other survivors?" "Survivors," Neville mused, stroking his pale cheek. "There are no survivors. Not you. Not I. We are all condemned." His voice trailed off as he used what strength he possessed to prop himself up on shaky arms. "Tell me, boy," the bandit wheezed. "How is it that you crawled out of that pit? That you came to possess such a blade?" Yes, such a blade. I've never seen its like." Rise's throat was dry, and his arms quivered from passion and exhaustion, but he forced himself to speak evenly. "The women. What happened to Ashe and Helena?" Neville collapsed against the wall and tugged at the woolly blanket, wrapping it tightly about himself as if to stave off an abrupt chill. As the fabric shifts, Rise notes even the blanket is slick with blood. Suddenly the boy is startled as the bandit captain bellows hoarsely. I knew I must die. I knew it from the start. But please, not like this. For the love of all that is good in this world, not like this. Neville snarled. I was a captain of men. I have laid low the mighty and plundered the powerful. Why must I meet my fate at the hands of some blasted storm? Neville began to curse and howl. A wild look in his eye tells Rise the bandit's mind is unraveling. Listen here, you wretch. Rise roars at the madman. I have not overcome the mountain in the storm to hear the deranged rantings of a lunatic. What has become of this place? Where are Ashe and Helena? I will not ask a third time. The anger and frustration are evidently written on the boy's face, even as he struggles to stay on his feet. But Neville holds his tongue despite Rise's warning. For a brief moment, the captain of Mailer's eyes cool, and Rise sees the man is not as unhinged as he would have him believe. The moment is quickly concealed as the bandit suddenly lurches from his perch, casting aside his blanket and putting his gruesome wounds on full display for the boy. Dragging his mangled frame across the floor over the numerous treasures, the man moves with exaggerated flailing. It was hard to see the full extent of his injuries, but Rise suspected that when the building had collapsed, a portion of it had landed on the unsuspecting captain. Aside from the obvious abdominal injury, the whole right side of his body had taken substantial damage, notably crippling his right leg. Finally, Neville reached the object of his desire, a strong box whose lid lay smashed beside it. Gasping for breath, Neville pulled from it a book. Satisfied, he slanted his eyes towards Rise and muttered, You know what this is, boy? It was Rise's turn to remain silent, but Neville only smirked, clutching the book over his sopping gash as he wheezed. We, here, we are a people of laws. We rob, we cheat, we kill, but not from each other. What's more, we honor our laws. What separates us from our marks in common trash, like yourself, and that grease spot of a lout you call kin. This here is an account of every soul, every worthless sod that has ever broken our commandments. The list of what judgments were passed? You, your uncle, right here. Neville's words hissed as he sat up, his left hand shifting behind his back as he shook the bloody book deliberately at Rise. Ashe too. Rise took one step forward, but thought better of it. He knew what game Neville was playing at. He just needed to string him along until he could make sense of what had happened to Ashe. As he stifled the boiling anger deep in the pit of his stomach, he gritted his teeth to keep quiet. He had the upper hand. He just had to control himself. To bring my judgment into question is to challenge the vermin of Mailer's way of life, Neville continued in a goading tone, growing annoyed by the boy's silence. I am a just man. I knew that she did not mean any insult, but even with Helena telling her to bite her tongue, she continued her railing. Such behavior could not go unrewarded, Neville smirked. When she continued to challenge my judgment on your verdicts, I had no choice. Our laws are clear, but enough blood had been spilled on your behalf, and since she did not approve of our ways, the solution was all too obvious, Neville taunted venomously. When Rise did not budge, Neville arched his handsome brow, studying the boy before crooning. Does fear hold such sway over your heart that you dare not move? I cannot say I expected better from Case and Slot, but never let it be said that I did not hope for more. Rise had heard all he cared to hear. His heart was heavy and his body had been pushed well beyond the point of exhaustion. Carefully, he moved toward Neville Abio, holding the callus erect, at eye level. Neville shifted himself to his knees, an animalistic gleam in his eyes, anticipating Rise below. Halting just outside of Neville's lunging range, the boy held pat. Sweat beaded on Neville's deathly pale brow as he met the fiery blue eyes of Sanwin Rise. As the young thief prepared his strike, Neville quickly flipped the book at the boy's face and drew the dagger he had been concealing behind his back in one swift motion, lunging up to deflect the callus. Rise was unfazed by the bandit's tactics and brought the sword down upon Neville Labayo's brow with all of his might. In an instant, the sword slashed through man and blade alike, leaving Rise alone on the mountain. Withdrawing the callus, Rise stood over the corpse of the scoundrel responsible for so much of his loss. He was a little surprised that there was not even some pleasure in killing that sod, but he did not feel much of anything other than relief. Rise heard the sword fall to the ground, and when he looked down he saw that his hands were trembling. That was not right at all. He was probably just tired. It was over now. He had no reason to fear. Walking toward the blanket Neville had been bundled in mere moments earlier, Rise's mind began to wander, whisking him far away from the carnage that surrounded him. He wondered what Kaysen would have said if he could see the merry adventure his nephew had been on without him. He would be proud, surely. The jolly old fellow could rest easy now, with the knowledge that he had been avenged, even if he was stuck on this wretched mountain. His uncle would have plenty of company. The storm had seen to that. He could tell them all off, give those sods a piece of his mind. Rise smiled as he thought of Kaysen mocking that blasted mob, imagining what witty retorts he'd serve. While he was at it, he could give that dragon a talking to as well. The creature would have to eat his words now the justice had been duly served. Huddling next to the fire, the boy warmed his numb hands and tried to work around the blood stain on the blanket. Maybe, if Neville Labayo hadn't been lying, there was still some hope for Ashe. Maybe Rise wasn't the only person to escape the mountain. His heart warmed at the thought of the girl finding her way back to Tesh, perhaps even discovering that she's royalty and being welcomed home with open arms. If anyone ought to be a princess, it was her. He'd seen his fair share of nobility, and none had her grace or bearing. He felt a pang of anxiety at the thought of her running off without him, though. Perhaps, if she waited on discovering her place in the world, he could find her. They could meet again and travel the world like she had wanted. He'd be game now that he could not go back home. Just don't start without him. Don't leave him behind. She did not seem the type to leave a friend behind. Surely, she'd wait for him. Reaching behind himself, Rise tossed a stool onto the fiery barrel before lying down beside the lapping flames. His addled mind began to drift off with 1,000 thoughts rushing through his weary head. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but at this point, he did not care. If he died now, at least he would die wealthy. He softly chuckled to himself, though within his heart, Rise knew that his labor was far, far from over. However, he was much too tired to think of all that now. Rise did not know what the future held for him. He could barely say what the past had held. The only thing he knew for certain was that he would wake to the warmth of morning's light.